The aroma of freshly brewed coffee wrapped around me as I stepped into the small, bustling cafe on Maple Street. The city had just begun to stir, with the hum of morning conversations blending into the clinking of mugs and the hiss of steaming milk. I glanced at my phone to check the time. 10 minutes before my meeting. Just enough time to grab a cappuccino and collect my thoughts. The line wasn't long, but it moved slower than I'd hoped. I adjusted the strap of my bag, feeling a bit impatient. As I reached the counter, a voice behind me broke the rhythm of my thoughts. Morning rush, huh? I swear caffeine is a survival mechanism at this point. I turned slightly, catching the familiar face. It was Nate, Trev's younger brother. His grin was easy and unhurried, the exact opposite of the chaos around us. Nate? What are you doing in this part of town? I asked, my surprise evident. Early client meeting. But let's face it, coffee is the priority, he said, tapping the side of his temple with a smirk. His casual charm was infectious. We exchanged a few more words, mostly small talk, but there was an undertone I couldn't quite place. His eyes lingered just a second longer than necessary, and I felt a warmth rise to my cheeks. I told myself it was just the heat of the crowded cafe. When my order was ready, Nate stepped ahead to hold the door open for me. As I passed him, his hand brushed lightly against mine, a simple gesture that sent an unexpected jolt through me. Later that evening, as I lay in bed beside Trevor, the day replayed itself in fragments. Trev's steady breathing filled the room, a constant rhythm of stability that should have been comforting. Instead, I felt restless. Nate had looked at me in a way that Trev hadn't in years. It wasn't a criticism of my husband, it was simply a realization. Trev and I had settled into a comfortable routine, one where passion had taken a back seat to practicality. But Nate's gaze? It had made me feel alive, as if I were more than just someone's wife. Long day? Trevor's voice pulled me back to the present. He didn't look away from his laptop as he asked, his fingers still tapping out an email. Yeah, just a lot on my mind, I said, trying to keep my tone light. He nodded absent-mindedly. I've got that presentation tomorrow. Should wrap up by 6. Maybe we can grab dinner afterward? Sure, I replied, though I already knew he'd cancel. Work always came first for him. I turned on my side, my back to him, and let my mind wander back to the cafe. Nate's easy laughter, the way he leaned slightly closer when he spoke. It was harmless, I told myself. A fleeting moment, nothing more. And yet, as sleep eluded me, I realized something had shifted. It wasn't just about Nate, it was about me. About the version of myself I hadn't seen in years. The next morning, as Trev left for the office with a quick peck on my cheek, I found myself lingering over breakfast. My phone buzzed on the counter, a group chat notification from Trev and Nate about an upcoming family gathering. I hesitated for a moment before opening it, my fingers hovering over Nate's name. A simple good morning felt too casual, too calculated. I shook off the thought and set the phone aside. The truth was, I didn't know what I wanted, but for the first time in a long time, I felt something more than the monotony of routine. It scared me and excited me. As I stepped outside into the brisk morning air, I found myself hoping I'd run into him again. The dining table was impeccably set, the soft glow of candlelight casting warm shadows across the room. Trevor had insisted on hosting Nate for dinner, something about reconnecting as brothers. I'd spent the day preparing, but now, as we sat down to eat, I felt like an outsider in my own home. Nate arrived fashionably late, carrying a bottle of wine and his signature grin. Hope I'm not too late. Traffic was a nightmare, he said, shrugging off his jacket. Trevor waved it off. You're here now. That's what matters. His tone was as steady and predictable as always. As the evening unfolded, conversation flowed easily between the brothers. They talked about work, childhood memories, and plans for the weekend. But I was only half listening. My attention was drawn to Nate. His laughter, the way he gestured with his hands when he spoke, the glint of mischief in his eyes when he caught me watching him. Every so often, our gazes would meet, fleeting but electric. It was subtle enough not to draw attention, yet charged with an intensity that left me breathless. Nate's smile lingered a second longer than it should have, and my heart raced. Trevor, ever oblivious, continued recounting a story from his last business trip. I nodded along, but my mind was elsewhere, replaying the way Nate's hand had brushed against mine as he passed the breadbasket. It was an innocent gesture, but it sent a current through me. After dinner, Trevor retired to his office to finish some work. Nate lingered in the living room, swirling the last of his wine in the glass. I offered to walk him to his car, using the excuse of grabbing something from the garage. As we stood by the car, the conversation shifted to my car's faulty engine. "I could take a look at it sometime," Nate offered casually, his tone light, but his eyes searching. "That'd be great," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. "Maybe tomorrow?" He agreed, and I watched as he drove off, the headlights disappearing into the night. I knew I was playing with fire, but I couldn't stop myself. The next afternoon, Nate arrived as promised. Trevor was out of town for work, and the house felt unusually quiet. Nate worked on the car in the driveway, while I brought him tools and refreshments. The air between us was thick with unspoken words. At one point, he wiped his hands on a rag and leaned against the car. "Should be good to go now," he said, his voice casual, but there was a tension in his eyes. "Thank you," I murmured, taking a step closer. My heart pounded so loudly I was sure he could hear it. For a moment, neither of us spoke. The world seemed to narrow, leaving just the two of us in this charged silence. And then, without thinking, I closed the distance between us and kissed him. It was tentative at first, testing the boundaries, but the moment his lips met mine, a surge of adrenaline coursed through me. Nate stiffened, his initial shock evident, but then he responded, his hands finding their way to my waist. The kiss was brief, a moment of recklessness that neither of us could take back. As we pulled apart, his eyes searched mine, filled with equal parts desire and hesitation. "Amber," he began, but I shook my head, stepping back. "I should go," I whispered, my voice barely audible. Without waiting for his response, I turned and walked into the house, my cheeks burning. That night, as I lay in bed, I replayed the kiss over and over. Trevor's absence only amplified the quiet, giving space for my thoughts to spiral. But to my surprise, guilt never came. Instead, I felt an aching need to see Nate again. I wasn't naive. I knew what I'd done was dangerous, even selfish. But it wasn't just about the kiss. It was about what it represented. A part of me that had been dormant for years had been awakened, and I wasn't ready to let it go. As I stared at the ceiling, I realized one thing with startling clarity. I would find a way to see him again. This wasn't over, not by a long shot. The days following that first kiss felt like a whirlwind. Every mundane task seemed to carry an undercurrent of anticipation, as if my entire world had narrowed to a single focus. Nate. I told myself I wasn't doing anything wrong, just being polite, helpful, even neighborly. But deep down, I knew I was lying to myself. It started with small excuses. Trevor mentioned that Nate needed some old financial documents for a side project. "I'll drop them off," I said quickly, not even waiting for Trevor to finish. He barely looked up from his laptop, simply nodding in agreement. When I arrived at Nate's apartment, the excuse felt paper thin. He answered the door in a worn t-shirt and jeans, his hair slightly disheveled. The casualness of his appearance caught me off guard, making him seem even more accessible, more real. "Amber," he greeted, his tone cautious. He didn't need to ask why I was there. The look in his eyes said he already knew. "I brought these," I said, holding up the folder, my voice steady but my pulse racing. "Thanks," he replied, taking it from me. His fingers brushed against mine, a fleeting touch that sent a shiver up my spine. Our meetings became more frequent after that. Sometimes I'd bring coffee to his office, pretending it was just a kind gesture. Other times, I'd claim I was in the neighborhood and drop by unannounced. Each encounter was brief, but charged with an energy that left me breathless. One afternoon, as I stood in the doorway of his office, Nate finally addressed the tension between us. "Amber, this has to stop," he said, his voice firm but conflicted. "Stop what?" I asked, feigning innocence. "You know what?" he said, running a hand through his hair. "You're Trevor's wife. This, this isn't right." His words were logical, but the way his eyes lingered on me betrayed his resolve. I stepped closer, closing the distance between us. "Do you really want me to stop?" I whispered, my voice low but steady. For a moment, he didn't answer. The silence stretched between us, heavy and electric. Then he exhaled sharply, turning away as if trying to escape the pull between us. "I don't know," he admitted finally, his voice barely audible. Back at home, the contrast between Trevor and Nate grew more apparent with each passing day. Trevor's life revolved around schedules, deadlines, and spreadsheets. Even when he was physically present, his mind was elsewhere, buried under a mountain of work. One evening, as we sat across from each other at the dinner table, Trevor launched into a detailed explanation of his latest project. I nodded along, but my thoughts were miles away, replaying the way Nate had looked at me earlier that day, the way his hand had lingered just a moment too long on mine when I passed him a cup of coffee. "Are you even listening?" Trevor's voice pulled me back to the present. "Of course," I replied quickly, forcing a smile. He sighed, clearly unconvinced, but too tired to argue. "Never mind, it's just been a long day." He reached for his phone, scrolling through emails as he ate. The sight filled me with an ache I couldn't fully explain. It wasn't that Trevor was a bad husband. In fact, he was everything a partner should be: dependable, responsible, loyal. But somewhere along the way, we'd lost the spark that once defined our relationship. With Nate, it was different. Every glance, every accidental touch felt alive, brimming with possibilities. He made me feel seen in a way I hadn't felt in years. Our next meeting was unplanned, at least on his part. I showed up at his apartment under the guise of returning something Trevor had borrowed. Nate opened the door, his expression a mix of surprise and exasperation. "Amber," he began, but I didn't let him finish. "We need to talk," I said, stepping inside before he could protest. He closed the door behind me, his movements slow and deliberate. "This is dangerous," he said, his voice heavy with resignation. "Maybe," I admitted, meeting his gaze, "but doesn't it feel worth it?" For a moment, the only sound was the faint hum of the refrigerator. Then he sighed, running a hand over his face. "You're going to get us both in trouble," he said, but there was no conviction in his tone. I smiled, taking a step closer. "Only if we're caught." That night, as I lay in bed beside Trevor, I felt a strange mix of exhilaration and unease. I knew I was treading dangerous waters, but I couldn't bring myself to stop. With Nate, I felt something I hadn't felt in years. Alive, desired, free. And yet, a small voice in the back of my mind whispered a warning. I ignored it, telling myself that as long as we were careful, everything would be fine. But deep down, I knew the tension was building, and it was only a matter of time before it all came to a head. The house buzzed with conversation and laughter, the warm glow of the evening settling over our guests. Trevor had gone all out for this party, an annual celebration of his recent successes at work. Our living room was packed with colleagues, friends, and family, the air thick with the clinking of glasses and polite laughter. Nate arrived late, as usual. His entrance was casual, yet his presence felt like a magnetic force pulling me across the room. Dressed sharply, but with an effortless air, he greeted Trevor with a brotherly hug and joined the crowd. I stayed near the kitchen, offering drinks and keeping conversations light, but my eyes were drawn to him constantly. Every movement he made, every glance in my direction sent a spark of energy through me. As the evening wore on, Trevor became preoccupied with entertaining his colleagues. I used the opportunity to slip away to the quieter side of the house, taking refuge in the guest room under the guise of checking on extra supplies. A few moments later, the door creaked open and Nate stepped inside. "Need some help?" he asked, his voice low and filled with an edge of teasing. I turned to face him, my heart pounding. "What are you doing here?" I whispered, though I already knew the answer. "You looked like you needed saving from the small talk," he replied, stepping closer. The air between us felt electric, the muffled sounds of the party a distant hum. "Nate, this is insane," I said softly, my voice trembling not from fear, but from anticipation. "Then tell me to leave," he challenged, his gaze steady and unwavering. I didn't. Instead, I took a step closer, the gap between us shrinking until there was nothing left but the inevitable. His hand brushed against mine, and in that moment, the weight of everything we'd been suppressing broke free. Our kiss was urgent, raw, and filled with all the emotions we'd been holding back. His hands found my waist, pulling me closer, and for a brief moment, the world outside that room ceased to exist. But the sound of footsteps in the hallway snapped us back to reality. We broke apart, both breathing heavily, our eyes locked in a mix of desire and panic. "We should get back," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. "Yeah," he agreed, though neither of us moved for a long moment. Finally, I straightened my dress and slipped out of the room, my heart still racing as I rejoined the party. That night, after the guests had left and Trevor had gone to bed, I sat alone in the living room, staring at the remnants of the evening. Empty glasses and crumpled napkins littered the surfaces, but my mind was far from the chaos of cleanup. I couldn't keep living like this. The kiss in the guest room had made it clear. This wasn't just a fleeting infatuation. It was something deeper, something I couldn't ignore any longer. Trevor's love for me had become routine, predictable, devoid of the passion we once shared. And I had changed. The thrill I felt with Nate wasn't just about him. It was about rediscovering a part of myself that I thought I'd lost. The next morning, I made a choice. Over breakfast, I was distant, responding to Trevor's questions with curt answers and avoiding eye contact. "You okay?" he asked, pausing between bites of toast. "Yeah, just tired," I replied, forcing a smile that didn't reach my eyes. But my mind was already planning. I began withdrawing, slowly but deliberately. The warmth I once showed Trevor turned cold. I stopped initiating conversations, stopped pretending to care about his long-winded work stories. Trevor, ever the optimist, chalked it up to stress. "Maybe we should take a trip soon," he suggested one evening. "Just the two of us." I nodded absent-mindedly, knowing full well that the trip would never happen. With each passing day, my thoughts revolved more and more around Nate. I replayed every stolen glance, every whispered word, every touch that left my skin tingling. The guilt that should have weighed on me never came. Instead, I felt a strange sense of clarity. I wasn't the same woman Trevor had married, and I couldn't keep pretending to be her. My heart and my desires had shifted, and there was no turning back. By the end of the week, I knew what I had to do. My life with Trevor was a chapter that needed to end, and Nate was the beginning of something new. Whether it was reckless or selfish didn't matter anymore. For the first time in years, I felt like I was finally making a choice for myself, and I wasn't going to stop now. The changes didn't go unnoticed for long. Trevor, ever attuned to patterns and predictability, began to sense the growing distance between us. At first, he chalked it up to stress or exhaustion, but as days turned into weeks, his unease became more apparent. "Is everything okay?" he asked one evening, his voice steady but his eyes searching. "Of course," I replied too quickly, forcing a smile. "Why wouldn't it be?" He nodded, but his expression remained unconvinced. Trevor wasn't one to pry, but his silence carried weight, as though he were piecing together a puzzle I hadn't meant for him to see. Meanwhile, Nate had grown distant. His texts, once filled with playful banter and lingering subtext, became sporadic and brief. When I tried to call, he often let it go to voicemail, later claiming he was busy. I cornered him one afternoon, catching him as he left the gym. "You've been avoiding me," I said, my tone sharper than I intended. "Amber, this is getting dangerous," he replied, his voice low as he glanced around to ensure no one could overhear. "Trevor's not stupid. He's starting to notice." "So what?" I challenged, crossing my arms. "Are you scared?" He sighed, running a hand through his hair. "This isn't a game, Amber. He's my brother. What do you think will happen when he finds out?" I stared at him, a mix of frustration and hurt bubbling to the surface. "Maybe I don't care anymore," I said, my voice barely above a whisper. He looked at me then, his expression conflicted. "Well, I do," he said before walking away, leaving me standing alone in the parking lot. Trevor's suspicions only deepened. I could feel his eyes on me when he thought I wasn't looking, the way he lingered over my phone left on the counter, or how he subtly asked about my plans for the day. One evening, as I sat on the couch scrolling through my emails, he spoke without looking up from his laptop. "You've been seeing Nate a lot lately," he said casually, though the tension in his voice betrayed him. "He's your brother," I replied smoothly, not missing a beat. "You know how he is. He always needs help with something." Trevor nodded, but the look in his eyes lingered. He didn't press further, but I knew the seed of doubt had been planted. The breaking point came one quiet Sunday afternoon. Trevor had been cleaning the garage when he found something, a receipt for a lunch I'd had with Nate weeks ago, long after I'd told Trevor I was running errands. He walked into the kitchen, holding the slip of paper like it was a weapon. "Amber," he began, his tone deceptively calm. "Is there something you want to tell me?" I froze, my mind racing. "I don't know what you mean," I said, trying to keep my voice steady. "This," he said, holding up the receipt. "You told me you were at the store. Were you with Nate?" "It was nothing," I said quickly, my cheeks burning. "He needed help with something, that's all." Trevor's jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he might let it go. But then he took a step closer, his voice low and unyielding. "Are you sleeping with him?" The question hung in the air like a thunderclap. "No," I said firmly, meeting his gaze. It wasn't entirely a lie, not in the way he meant. He studied me for what felt like an eternity before shaking his head. "You're lying," he said quietly. "I'm not," I insisted, my voice rising. "You're imagining things, Trevor. Maybe if you paid more attention to what's happening here, instead of burying yourself in work, you wouldn't be so paranoid." The accusation landed like a slap, and for a moment, I thought I'd won. But then Trevor turned and walked out of the room, leaving me alone with the weight of my own words. Later that night, I heard him in his office, rummaging through files and papers. When he finally emerged, he held his phone in his hand, his face pale and tense. "You left your messages open on your computer," he said, his voice cold. My stomach dropped. He held the screen toward me, the incriminating text between Nate and me glaring back at me in harsh, damning light. "Don't bother denying it," he said, his voice breaking. "I trusted you, Amber. I trusted both of you." The words cut deeper than I expected, but I didn't flinch. There was no point in pretending anymore. "I'm sorry you had to find out this way," I said quietly. Trevor laughed bitterly, his eyes filled with disbelief. "Sorry? That's all you have to say?" For the first time in months, I felt a pang of guilt, but it was fleeting. My path had already been chosen, and there was no going back. The house was unbearably quiet. The absence of Trevor's steady footsteps and Nate's laughter created a void that seemed to echo through every room. The walls, once warm and filled with life, now felt cold and distant, as if they, too, had turned their backs on me. After that night, Trevor moved out. He didn't yell or fight. He simply packed a suitcase, leaving behind a marriage that had been irreparably broken. His parting words were calm, almost devoid of emotion. "I can't do this, Amber." Not anymore. The sight of him closing the door behind him stayed with me, not because it hurt, but because of the finality of it. The chapter was closed, and there was no rewriting it. Nate was next to leave. I hadn't seen him in days when I finally mustered the courage to call. His voice on the other end was tense, resigned. "I can't stay here," he said simply. "It's too much. For me, for Trevor, for everyone." "You're running away," I accused, though my voice lacked its usual strength. "Maybe," he admitted, his tone softening. "But I can't keep living like this, Amber. It's not fair to anyone." There was a long pause before he added, "I'm sorry." The line went dead before I could respond, leaving me holding the phone in silence. In the days that followed, I wandered through the house like a ghost, the memories of what once was haunting every corner. The dining room table still bore faint scratches from countless dinners with Trevor. The guest room, where everything had spiraled out of control, remained untouched, the air heavy with a past I couldn't erase. I spent hours staring at my reflection in the mirror, searching for the woman I used to be. But she was gone, replaced by someone I barely recognized. The first rain of the season came unexpectedly one evening. I stood by the window, watching as the droplets blurred the world outside, making everything look softer, less defined. It felt fitting. My life, too, had become a series of blurred lines and broken edges. As I stood there, memories flooded back. Trevor's laugh when we first moved into this house, the way Nate looked at me during that dinner, his gaze igniting something I hadn't felt in years. The choices I'd made, the risks I'd taken, all for a fleeting moment of passion and freedom. I didn't regret it. That was the truth. I had lived the way I wanted, followed my desires without hesitation. But now, staring out at the rain-soaked streets, I understood the weight of my decisions. Every choice had a cost, and mine was loneliness. I turned away from the window and walked through the empty house, each step echoing louder than the last. The silence wasn't comforting. It was suffocating, but it was mine. As I settled into the armchair by the fireplace, I picked up a book I'd been meaning to read for years. The words blurred together at first, my mind too preoccupied with the what-ifs and could-have-beens. But then, slowly, I began to lose myself in the story, the outside world fading into the background. For the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of peace. It wasn't happiness or contentment, but it was enough. Enough to remind me that life would go on, even if it wasn't the life I had imagined. The next morning, as the sun broke through the rain clouds, I found myself at the window again, coffee in hand. The light illuminated the room, chasing away the shadows that had lingered too long. I realized then that my story wasn't over. This was just another chapter, messy and imperfect, but mine all the same. And while I didn't know what the future held, I knew one thing for certain. I would face it head-on, just as I had faced everything else. Because in the end, I had chosen this path, and I would walk it, no matter where it led.